Hey everybody, welcome to episode 3 of Papers in a Pinch. The paper that I'll be going over in this episode is called Generalization in Diffusion Models Arises from Geometry, Adaptive, Harmonic Representations. You can see the authors there, right? We've got Zara, Florentin, Aero, and Stefan. You got New York University and Collège de France. So this paper is essentially a response to some of the recent work that's come out that suggests diffusion models maybe memorizing the data as opposed to generally learning what it means to create an image. And these authors come forward and say, no, we believe diffusion models really are learning what it means to create an image. That's essentially what this work is about. So let me just quickly define diffusion models. I'll just go over the abstract briefly. We'll get into the meat of it by going over the core mathematics, and then we'll come back and take a look at the charts that they have in the paper so we can put those into context and understand what they mean. So just really quickly, a lot of you probably already know this, but diffusion models are obviously at the heart of a lot of today's AI, the most popular, kind of form of what we see in AI systems today. If you go online, you look up diffusion models, you Google that, whatever, you can put a text prompt in and you can generate original images via these AI models. And those are essentially diffusion models. And what diffusion models are is basically taking the noise out of a data taking the noise out of noisy data down to an actual clean image, right? So the way these models would be trained, first you would add a bunch of noise to, millions of clean images, and then you would essentially learn a denoiser, which would learn how to remove that noise until you get back to not the original image, but some brand new image. So in other words, if you can understand the relationship between noise and clean images, and you can understand how to model that so that you could remove that noise back to some kind of original image, that's what a diffusion model is. So it's learning about how noise can effectively be removed. It's trying to get at the, as we'll see, the probability densities of clean images, of noisy images, how those are related to each other, so you can kind of reverse the noising process to a denoising process and get back to nice quality original images. Okay. So, as it says in this abstract, there's been some work recently that suggests maybe these denoising models, right, these diffusion models, are not actually learning. Maybe they're just memorizing aspects of the data and I guess combining those memorized pieces into images. And so maybe they're not that original. And these authors are saying, no, that's not the case. They take different parts of data that aren't talking to each other, if you will, and train different diffusion models, and they see that they still come up with quality images. They can come up with actually the same type of results. And as we'll see, they do, they compare the training to the test, and they take a look at how the performance differs between them. I'll talk more about that, but basically they make a bunch of arguments that show that these diffusion models are indeed learning. They're not just memorizing the data. And we'll take a look at how they kind of recast the denoiser function in terms of a Jacobian, or specifically an eigen decomposition of that Jacobian. Talk about what that means. But it allows them to pick apart the eigenvectors and the eigenvalues and take a look at, the directions along the data that are being used, and it shows where the invariances are. And anyways, eventually they fold that into an argument that says these diffusion models are essentially learning what they call geometry adaptive harmonic bases. Okay, so in other words, they're not just memorizing data; they are learning, and the thing they're learning in other words, the way these authors are going to argue that the learning is indeed happening, aside from some of that training versus test evidence, is by picking apart the learned function itself, theoretically anyway, looking at the eigenvectors, looking at the eigenvalues, and showing what in the images they're picking up on. Okay, so it shows kind of how the DNN is actually creating abstractions, if you will, during its learning process. It is picking up on genuine things. It is actually learning. Okay, and then they show different charts and graphs that kind of help defend some of that work. So that's what this paper is about. Hope that made sense. Let's jump into the mathematics first, because it's obviously going to show how the models are set up, and more to the point, it kind of theoretically backs up the arguments that these authors are making that genuine learning is happening. And of course, that's important. And then, like I said, we'll go back to the charts and we'll go look at all the different things in the paper so that you can understand them in context. So we'll start with this idea of the diffusion model variance and the denoising generalization. Let's pick apart kind of the basic mathematics of a diffusion model in general, and then let's fold in some of the arguments in this paper. So This all comes down to the notion of noisy images, right? Again, a diffusion model, you're going to add a bunch of noise to images, and then you want to learn how to reverse that process, remove the noise back to the essence of what an image is so that you could, the AI model can create images, right? Just from things like text prompts. So this is the basic outline here, okay? And if you look at the annotated version, you've got Y being a noisy image, X being a clean image, and Z being the noise. So this is just the relationship between clean images and noisy images, essentially, right? So the very high-level view of what a diffusion model is in AI. The noise that gets added, the Z term, is going to follow a normal distribution. So if you're going to add a bunch of noise, you think of it sampling the noise, if you will, from a normal distribution. That's where it's going to come from, right? And reasonable, I guess, assumption that noise would follow something like a bell curve, right? And that's going to be added to the clean image, and then that's what gives you the noisy image. So nothing too surprising here, right? Clean image plus noise gives you a noisy image. They're just saying, just so you know, the noise is assumed to follow a normal distribution. The goal here, like I said, is to learn how a probability distribution of the noisy image, okay, relates to the probability distribution of the clean image. Okay, so we're trying to set it up to understand this in terms of probability distributions, which is obviously a normal way to go about trying to theoretically understand what is happening within these deep neural networks. Okay, so now you start to pick that relationship, right? We're still talking about the same thing, back here, but let's pick it apart a bit in terms of more probability, right? Because that's going to allow us to be more theoretical, put it on a more rigorous foundation. So we get this idea of a density relationship between, again, the noisy image and the clean image, right? So you've got this essentially, let's get the annotated version here. The density of the noisy image, again, same thing on the left-hand side. And we can think about it as combining the original image density, right? The clean image density with a conditional density, okay? And integrating over that. So you've got the clean image density, and then you want to know, so you're thinking in terms of like posterior distributions and things like that, right? You have this conditional density, which would be tell me what, the probability of the noisy image is given the clean image. That's what we're trying to do, right? That's the probabilistic kind of density relationship that we're trying to go after here. That's literally just the definition of a diffusion model, right? Let's recast that into a slightly different form. You can kind of see this now is the bell curve noise essentially, right? So here's your Gaussian noise. Here is the clean image data, or more to the point, the noise with, it's another way of expressing, the conditional density of that noisy image with the clean image, right? You kind of have this difference between the clean image and the Gaussian added noise. Okay, integrate over that over all noise levels, if you will, right? Because you're adding noise, and then you're going to learn how to denoise that. So you do that over all noise levels, hence the integration sign. And then presumably that's going to give you this density of the noisy image. Okay, so it's just kind of a standard way to mathematically define how you would go after the density of that noisy image. Hope that made sense. Now, let's think about this in terms of scale space representation. So I said the noise that's getting added to the images is Gaussian distributed. Now you can imagine that as the sigma increases, so as you add more noise, obviously the images are going to become noisier. We say that creates a scale space representation similar to how a diffusion process spreads out over time. So this is, if you're wondering why these things are called diffusion models, you're borrowing a lot of concepts from just, the physics and the chemistry, if you will, of a diffusion process. If you were to try to model, dropping ink maybe into water and watching it diffuse, you're going to have mathematical relationships and concepts associated with that. That's been borrowed to try to understand, or to actually quite frankly build these diffusion models. It's a lot of the same concepts. So here I show basically getting noisier and noisier data, right? We can think of Gaussian distributed noise as the shape of the uncertainty, if you will, right? And you're going to flatten out that shape of uncertainty the more noise you add. Now that sounds kind of obvious, right? You're kind of getting more variance there, you're flattening it out. But now let's think about that in terms of actual diffusion process and why we call that scale space. So you can see, imagine this is ink being dropped into water, right? This is like quite literally physically diffusion, right? Now, this might not be the best way to view it, but you can imagine that at the early part, when we first start to drop that in, it has essentially more structure, right? It's tightly bound. This would be like a more tightly bound proper bell curve, if you want, if you're modeling it as a Gaussian distribution. As it spreads out, we're adding noise, And even though it still kind of looks structured here, you can imagine that eventually this would fill the whole box and this would be very smooth. Okay. Now, what you're doing is you're seeing things, or one way to think about it is you're seeing things at different scales, right? Kind of coarse-grained versus granular, you're seeing it at both kind of the fine-grained and the coarse-grained, if you will, right? So you can imagine you have a lot of coarse structure at the beginning, you add noise, you add noise, you add noise. It's kind of similar to essentially reaching thermodynamic equilibrium. You spread out. It's kind of like seeing this distribution maybe get closer to a uniform distribution, right? You don't have any major peak where you expect the probability to be. It's all the same stuff. Okay, so those are different scales. If you keep adding noise to an image, it's kind of like waiting for the ink to disperse, and you start getting closer to a kind of a uniform distribution. It starts to spread out. It's looking at something at a different scale. You don't have the same structure. It's kind of like stepping back from it, if you will, as opposed to zooming in and seeing the fine-grained detail. So anyways, when the authors say they form a scale space representation, that's what the noise is doing. It's a way of thinking of looking at an image, if you will, at different scales. Sometimes it's got a lot of structure, a lot of detail, and sometimes it smooths out and looks like nothing. You can imagine if you added a ton of noise to an image, it would just look like a single smooth, blurry image. And if you reverse that process, it's kind of like getting rid of the noise, getting the peak in your distribution back, and now you see the fine-grained detail of the image itself. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense. So you can think of it as an analogy. Informationally, it really is the same thing, right? It's a diffusion process that we're trying to reverse. So it would be like running this thing in reverse to get your image back. Okay. So hopefully you can see the relationship there. And again, we're just thinking in terms of probability densities. So now I want to talk about learning scores. So now, because we started off super generally and said, this is what a diffusion model is, right? Like clean image plus noise, and then reversing it. And the noise is Gaussian distributed. That's literally, that's all that says, right? And then you say, but we're talking about probability distribution. So we'll set it up as the density of the clean image, a conditional probability of the noisy image given the clean image, right? Integrated over all the noise levels. That is going to give you the density of the noisy image, right? Because if you understand those densities, if you understand it in terms of probability, you can actually build a model to reverse the process. And then I said, look, physically, that's essentially, that's what's happening physically. Okay. Now, because we're talking about deep learning here, you can't get after that density directly, which is always the case, right? In artificial intelligence, we're dealing with complex models here. So you're not going to extract anything from the model and say, analytically, here's my probability, right? It would be like trying to extract a joint distribution from like a million different distinct distributions or something. Again, these are abstractions, okay? It's not like there are real probability distributions sitting inside networks, right? So it's a way to talk about informationally and probabilistically what's happening in a network. So because you can't go after them directly, you're going to have to do kind of proxy things or indirect things to try to get a sense of what the probability distribution in the network is doing, because that's what you need to know to be able to, essentially reverse this process and get to the density that you want, to be able to create images, okay? To understand how the noisy images relate to the clean images. And so really, so the next step is to understand this as trying to learn scores, okay? And go to the annotated version here. The score here is just the gradient of the log probability of the noisy data. Okay, so I'll talk about the rest of this expression in a second, but what the score is it's saying, conceptually, we can't go after the distribution directly, but if we can get this thing called a score, which is the gradient or the direction, if you will, that things seem to locally change around that distribution, then we can kind of guide the process. So imagine you put a text prompt in online, and that's supposed to kind of somehow be guided towards a real image. Well, because you can't really know the probability distribution directly, if you can get a sense of how to maneuver, right? It's almost like you have a blindfold on, but you still have somebody tapping you on the shoulder to kind of guide you through, right? You need something to guide you through the probability distribution that's sitting within the network. So you can try to locate where in the possibility space you should land on something to produce an image. So it's like a proxy way to maneuver around the possibility space, or if you want to call it a manifold, right? Kind of the lower dimensional subspace, if you will, where you're supposed to land on to actually produce what you want to produce, which in the case of a diffusion model would be an image. You need a guide to do that. So these scores are telling you how to maneuver around these distributions so that you land on the part that you're supposed to land on. Okay, it's just a gradient. It's a common approach in probability to do a score. You take the gradient, and we know this from gradient-based learning methods, that the gradient kind of tells you where to locate the water, right? It tells you, whether it's going to dip or whether it's going to go up. So it's kind of directional information to maneuver through the space of possibilities to land on the manifold that you're supposed to land on. Hope that made sense. So you have the real score function, and then you have the score function that's going to be approximated by the diffusion model. There's a difference between those two. You can imagine that you would want to obviously minimize that difference to learn the score function. Okay, so I'll get to the part that's actually programmed into AI. This is not it. This is just theoretically saying this is kind of probably what the neural network is doing. It's as if it's learning a score function, and whatever we approximate has to be close to the true score function, which maybe you don't really know unless it was really simple data, and you're kind of minimizing that, right? So if you integrate this, right, over all the data or over all the noise, however you want to think of that, then that's going to give you the learned model distribution, and that's on the left. And what this is just the KL, right, Kullback-Leibler divergence, the KL divergence between your learned model distribution and the true data distribution, which is, of course, the goal, okay? You can always think of AI like this. It's trying to learn the actual distribution of the data, right? In this case, it would be image data. And if you did a good job, then there wouldn't be much difference between what you learned and the true data distribution, whatever that is, okay? So it's an indirect way of kind of getting at the difference between what you're learning and what you're going after. And the KL divergence is a good way to do that. And this is showing that KL divergence is actually bounded by the expected squared error between the true score function and the thing that you're learning, which is the approximate score function, integrated over all noise levels, okay? So again, just super high level conceptually, got a bunch of images, you add a bunch of noise to it, you want to reverse that process. You're not going to reverse that process unless you know what the heck you're doing. You don't know what the heck you're doing unless you have a way to kind of be guided along the distributions that you're trying to learn that you can't see directly. A score function is how you do that. So the diffusion model needs to learn a score function. That's obviously got to be pretty close to the actual score function. If you integrate over all noise levels and that difference gets minimized, it can end up bounding what you really want, which is the learned model distribution versus the true data distribution. Okay? I'll do a recap on all this, but hopefully that essentially makes sense. So that's what you're seeing here. Okay. And here's the score definition. Now, this is where you're kind of getting into the meat of what's actually happening, right? Because again, this is a lot of theoretical justification for what we think is going on in a neural network, what the authors think. We're getting closer to what actually gets programmed in, right? So why do we think it's a score function? What is the score function doing? Well, the denoiser that you learn is essentially approximating a conditional mean. Now, again, this isn't surprising, right? If you just look at this term, again, what is the model doing? Well, this would say, what is the probability of the clean image given the noisy image? So now you've kind of reversed it, right? But it's the same thing. You're looking for that relationship between the two. And this really speaks to the diffusion model, because this is where the reverse diffusion comes in, right? Because now you're trying to kind of recapture, although I don't like that term because you're not trying to get to the original image, but you are trying to learn essentially how to recreate the original images from the noisy data. Okay, so there's that flip, there's that reverse. That's really what a diffusion model is doing, and that's just a conditional mean, obviously, right? Because you're just talking in terms of probability, right? Probability of the noisy image, you got the probability of the clean image. What's the relationship between them two? So if you can get after the conditional mean, you're learning something about that relationship. And a lot of this just comes from this whole expression. This is not like just the authors, right? This comes from statistical estimation theory, right? The score function of a Gaussian distribution can be related to the conditional expectation. So it's more of a definition that's used. Why do we use logs? A lot of you probably know this already, but you're transforming products into sums, and that's going to simplify the derivatives. And so it's a convenient way to define the score function. Okay, so if the left side is the true score function, and the way that you get at that is by trying to learn a conditional mean as per statistical estimation theory, then this is what we're after, okay? Now, if we take a look at training the actual denoiser, so now we're kind of at the part where this is what's set up in the machine, right? This is what's set up as an optimization problem during the DNN training. This is going to relate to the actual loss function that gets programmed in. And this is essentially just the mean squared error of the denoiser. So when we talk about a diffusion model that you're trying to learn in deep learning, that's the denoiser. And hopefully it's obvious why it's called a denoiser. You're trying to remove noise back to images, right? Well, there's going to be a mean squared error of the denoiser as a function of the noise level. Okay, so X, again, is always that clean image. There's going to be a difference between that and what is effectively the output of your denoiser, which is its own kind of X, right? Because it's the output. So the output of your denoiser should not be that different than the clean image itself if you're doing this well, and that's going to give you a mean squared error. So how well the denoiser approximates the conditional mean, because this is relating to the conditional mean, right? Because the conditional mean is, again, what is the clean image probability given the noisy image probability, right? So that relates to the conditional mean, and that's what it means to train a denoiser. And then, here's the annotated version, right? So think of X as the true signal. This is the output of the denoiser. That gives you the mean squared error, right? That's going to relate back to the score function. I'm going to step through each of these. I'm going to go back, and we're going to step through the whole thing so you can see how this whole thing relates. Let me do one more thing here, which is before we get into the Jacobian stuff. So now that you have a mean squared error, this is saying if you had an optimal denoiser, it would have its own mean squared error as per the mean squared error definition here. But there's also the denoiser that we're actually training, which would have its own mean squared error. If you took the difference of those and you integrated over all the noise, then that gets us back to this KL divergence between the model you're trying to learn and the density of the clean image. Okay? So and then the next one's, okay, so let's just go back to the beginning. And what the take-home message here is that a lot of this is just kind of the theoretical justification for what the authors believe this neural network is doing, what the diffusion model is doing. And we're going to see why it makes sense to build all that up when we go into the Jacobian stuff and actually pick apart the denoiser and say, here's what it actually seems to be picking out in the images. Okay, so again, top level, this is what diffusion is, right? You got a noisy image. It's obviously related to a clean image plus noise. That noise is Gaussian distributed. Okay, you can kind of recast it in terms of the density relationships because you're going to talk in terms of probability. There's a conditional. There's the clean image. You can think about that as the relationship between X and Y. Again, X is the clean image. Y is the noisy image. It has noise. If you integrate over all that noise, you're presumably learning something about how to denoise images, right? Now, that's the annotated version, so that's everything I just said. Okay, and then I said what you're really doing here is a scale space representation, because if you add noise to an image, it's like viewing an image at a different scale. Sometimes you got the fine grained detail, sometimes you get more coarse grained, you get smoother. It's kind of like thermalization, it's like thermodynamic equilibrium. I give this kind of analogy here, although informationally it's not really just an analogy, right? If I drop ink into water, it spreads out. First it's coarse, and then, or it's very detailed rather, and then you go more coarse grained, you go smoother, 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 and eventually it would just be a single color. That's like adding noise. Now imagine trying to reverse that, right? It's like a diffusion model trying to come in and give you the original ink drop. If you understand the relationship between the noise and the cleanliness, then you could presumably, from a modeling perspective, remove that noise and get back to the cleanliness, right? Get back to the tightly packed, highly structured ink drop. That's essentially what a diffusion model is. Okay, and then we said, so theoretically, what's going on here when you learn a diffusion model? Well, it's probably something like learning scores, because scores give you a directionality. Take a look at the annotation version here, right? So if you learn a score, that's going to be different somewhat from the true score function. Again, it's kind of like you're blindfolded, someone's tapping you on the shoulder. It tells you how to navigate around the manifold, or around the probability distribution towards the manifold. Which is where the data is for the clean image, where you want to be. So this difference needs to be minimized, and if you do that, it's essentially a bound on the true goal, which is the difference between your learned model distribution and the true data distribution, which you can measure in a number of different ways, but one of the common ways would be the KL divergence. And then I said, okay, well, where does that score come from? And the authors are saying, statistical estimation theory basically just shows us that the score is defined in terms of a conditional expectation. Okay, and that makes sense. You've got this, what is the clean image density given? What is the probability of the clean image given the noisy image? That's literally what you're trying to do in a diffusion model. So there's that. Now we're going backwards, right? We're trying to remove the noise back to the clean image. And this essentially comes into training a denoiser, because if you can train this denoiser, if you can get this expectation, then you can get your conditional expectation, which gives you the score, right? Note what I'm doing. This is important, okay? I want to step back from here. If you can, let's go all the way back. Okay, so this is the reverse process, right? This is like everything you're trying to do. If you can get at the mean squared error difference between let's say an optimal or perfect denoiser, which is the thing you're learning, and the approximate one that you're actually learning with your model, okay? This is the thing you're after. If you can get after that, it means you're getting after this mean squared error, because that was literally what you were looking at in those differences of the mean squared error. You can only do that if you're able to calculate. So there's the mean squared error definition, which gets you this conditional mean, sorry, all right? Right? So if you're able to get this, you can get the conditional mean. If you can get the conditional mean, you can get the score. If you can get the score, you can approximate the score. You see how it goes backwards? And then it gets you all the way to the scale divergence, which is ultimately the thing that you're after, which is, getting back to the ink drop. Okay? I hope that makes sense. So it's just ultimately getting to the part where here's where you have to program it in, and that's going to get you all this other stuff as a proxy to the true distribution. Okay. Finally, they have this interpretation through Jacobian eigen decomposition. So what is this? So a Jacobian is a thing that you can do. You can take a Jacobian matrix on a function. You can decompose it, and it's going to give you the eigenvectors and the eigenvalues. And this is going to give you insights into the structure and behavior of the denoiser itself. And this is where everything we said prior was kind of just diffusion models. Like, that's how they work. Understand how the density relationships work together. You're going after that conditional mean. You can see how the reverse comes in. Now we're going to pick apart the thing that was learned and show that it's actually learning something in the data. It's not just memorizing. One way you could do that, as the authors do, is they do this Jacobian eigen decomposition. And that gives you, so this is a really busy slide. I apologize. Bear with me. But let's just pick it apart, and then we'll show how that suggests that there's definite learning happening. Okay. And there's experimental stuff to back this up too. So this is the Jacobian matrix. It provides a linear approximation, right, of that f at y around the point y. So here's the decomposition here. You get the eigenvalues and the eigenvectors, okay? Eigenvectors are like the directions along which the function is changing, okay? Now, the reason that's important is because if you can understand what the function is actually doing, and one way to do that would be the directions that it's changing, you can go back to the image data and kind of see how it seems to depend on the images, which quite literally in this case would mean what parts of the images does it seem to be picking up on. The eigenvalues are going to be how things are scaled along those directions. Okay, and this forms what they call an adaptive basis. So like any function or any function in machine learning, you can kind of think of as being formed, if you want, of individual smaller functions, right, that are trying to capture the dynamics of the system. And we talked about that a little bit in the last episode. And if you bunch all those together, then you kind of get the full function, right? So that's the basis, that those set of functions. If it's an adaptive basis, it seems to be obviously not too static. It seems to adapt to the changing input. In this case, they're going to say that it adapts to the geometry of the input data. And they're going to show evidence for that, okay? Small eigenvalues means the directions of local invariance, indicates robustness to noise in certain directions. That's a desirable property. So that's something the authors find, is these small eigenvalues. It's desirable to have. That might help you design things going forward, right, if you choose the design path. So it shows that this f at y here can be viewed as performing a transformation along the directions given by the eigenvectors and scaled by the eigenvalues, as I just said. Okay, now let's jump into it and let's see what they found, okay? So that's the math. That's the majority of the meat. There's a little bit of additional math at the end with some expanded kind of theoretical justifications, but that's, I believe, to be essentially the core meat of it, and we don't want to get too carried away or you might get lost a bit in one go anyways, but by all means, check out the paper yourself. Okay, so in figure 1, they're looking at the train versus the test data. And this is the transition from memorization to generalization. So hopefully you can see that well enough. Here on the legend, they're increasing the data. So basically from black to orange. And you can see that the performance, based on the way they define their axes here, this is actually performance decreasing as you increase the data. Okay, so it says here, dynamic range as a function of noise level for a training size. So as n increases, performance of the training set generally worsens on the left. However, the performance on the test improves. Okay, so this is kind of a classic indication that you're not just memorizing, or that you're transitioning from the memorization that might have been happening to true generalization, right? If you want, you're not going to have your test performance increase. Remember, test data is data that hasn't seen before, right? So that's not going to increase unless you have some genuine generalization happening, right? So if you keep increasing the data and the training is actually getting worse and worse, right? Think of that in terms of variance if you want, right? Or even model bias. You get more and more data, and the training is going down, but then when you test it, you get the reverse situation where it's getting better and better. Then presumably, the variance is not increasing with the increasing amount of data. If variance was increasing, you got too many fingers into the data and you're essentially just memorizing it, right? You probably have all seen, right, the classic kind of pictures of high variance, and it overfits the data. You're essentially just memorizing it. But this situation where you see the train go down and the test go up in terms of performance is indicative that that variance isn't kind of exploding, or isn't going after too much data. It's not memorizing it. You're truly keeping the variance low and you're learning something genuine. Okay, so that's kind of the first indication that even though there's other research going on that suggests that maybe there's memorization happening, that doesn't seem to be the case with these diffusion models. But let's get into more of the interesting stuff here, I think, where we actually talk about, especially the eigen decomposition stuff. But here's another example here. Okay, so they've got data increasing from left to right, and they've got two different data sets essentially, right? And when you have small data, if you look at the comparison between the closest image to the one that was generated by the model, they're pretty similar. And then you start to see differences as more and more data happen. Now, the more data is the more realistic situation, right? Obviously, that's more real world. So you're getting this 100,000 samples, and then you're coming up with something different than the original. Okay, and then you see the same thing here. A small amount of data, it's pretty similar to the original. Okay, there's the original. Actually, in this case, this is the original, sorry. And then this is the generated, and then it becomes quite different. So you've already got the situation of more data producing something that's different than the original data. More to the point, if you look at these two rows here, which is why they stacked it like this, the generated model on the S1 data set versus the generated model on the S2 produces almost the same image. Okay, but these are two completely different subsets of data. So it's part of the argument that genuine learning is happening. It's not just memorizing. Okay, and then take a look at the distribution of cosine similarity, and you can see that the samples from the 2D noisers shift to the right in blue. So you get that's that similarity happening here. And then the sampled and closest train image, they kind of do the opposite. They start to kind of concentrate towards the left there. The take-home message here in figure 2 is, again, if you're training two different denoisers on two different parts of the data, and they get away from the original image, but they can still land on a high-quality image that is similar, even though the data is different, it must be learning something. Like, there's no way you could do that through memorization, is basically the take-home message there. Okay? So that's part of the experimental showcasing of some of the theoretical stuff that we were talking about, but we're going to get more into that in a bit. Let's go to figure 3. Now, this is where it kind of gets interesting, right? Because now we talked about the eigen decomposition through the Jacobian to try to look at the eigenvalues and the eigenvectors. Like, what is that function actually doing? Right? Is it memorizing it, or is it learning something? So you can see here, this is where you're essentially taking a look at, whether it's oscillations in the eigenvalues or the eigenvectors. It has this fast decay. We won't get into too much detail, but the eigenvectors, the values, are essentially having this fast decay to it. And it ends up being indicative that you're essentially landing on specific patterns, if you will, in the images itself. So they say they analyze the denoiser trained on 100,000 face images, right? And they evaluate it on noisy test image. So you've got the clean, noisy, and the denoised image. The bottom left shows the decay of shrinkage values. Okay, so what the authors believe is happening is those eigenvalues are essentially acting as they're controlling essentially the directions of which the learning takes place along those eigenvectors. They're controlling it. They're calling it shrinkage in this case, it basically means that the input data is going to be, the model is going to be robust to the input data along certain directions. Okay, and it's not going to be, and it's going to be changed in other directions. So there's an invariance there, is the take-home message here. In other words, something is being learned, because that's what learning is, right? Learning is to be exposed to a bunch of data and to not have it all just be random or just be memorized, which is not learning, right? Memorization is actually kind of similar to random, right? Because you did not have to pick up on any pattern. But if you picked up on a pattern, there was invariance there. And that's what you can show from the eigenvectors, that there is actually an invariance being picked up on. And you can relate it to which parts, if you look at these, if you can see them, which parts of the images seem to have the hotspots. And you'll note that it actually seems to be picking up on certain geometric patterns, right? Like it's not just away from the face in a random direction. It's picking up on things that we recognize, right? So it says that you have these adaptive basis vectors from the eigenvectors, from the eigendecomposition, that contain oscillating patterns adapted to lie along the contours and within smooth regions of the image. Okay? So you decompose that denoiser function in terms of eigenvectors, you take a look at its oscillations, you analyze it essentially, and then you relate that analysis back to the images, which is something that we already recognize, and you can pick up on what the eigenvectors are doing, or more to the point, what the denoiser is actually doing. And it's not doing something random. It's not memorizing. It's picking up on specific geometric aspects of the original images, i.e. it is learning. It must be learning something. Okay, hope that makes sense. And then we have figure 4 here, which is, basically figure 4 and 5 is taking data that is known to be very more simple and geometric and showing that the denoisers are going to have near optimal performance on them. And if you take a look at a somewhat similar analysis, you can actually see very clearly that there are these kind of geometries that are being picked up on. Again, it's the same take-home message, right? That denoiser, as per the invariances that are being picked up via those eigenvectors, are picking up on what appears to be these kind of simpler geometric patterns. And that's obviously in line with deep learning neural networks in general, which we believe to be learning increasing levels of abstraction, let's say among the hidden layers. And those levels of abstraction are supposed to start with like maybe edges and corners and then build up into more complex, if you will, features, right? So it's totally in line with that. That's what figure 4 is showing. Figure 5, another example of that. This UNet is one of the denoisers that trains on a data set that translating and dilating disks. Okay, mix it up a little bit, but it's still kind of a simpler data set. Try to figure out what that denoiser is picking up on. You got that decay of the shrinkage factor. So again, eigenvalues and eigenvectors are doing something quite specific related to geometric data. It indicates that the network achieves and preserves a sparse representation of the true image. Again, it's actually learning. It's not just doing noise. It's not just memorizing. And on and on. And that's basically what these figures are showing. And you can pick up on the hotspots and you can see what it's actually doing from a geometric standpoint. Okay? I hope it doesn't sound like I'm going over that too high level, but that's the take-home message there. Yeah, and that's essentially the paper. So I'm just going to do one quick recap now that, again, we've looked at those images and we looked at the mathematics, and hopefully you understand what's happening. Again, diffusion models, take a bunch of images, add a bunch of noise, see if we can reverse the process so that we can get back from noisy data, which is kind of where you would be starting at, to an actual image. And can we show that genuine learning in these diffusion models is actually happening? These authors believe, yes, that's the case, and they've showcased that. Quite nicely, actually. If we take a look at some of the mathematical meat here, really the core stuff. Oh, this one's off right now. Let's just go to the paper. So again, we saw the relationship between the density of the noisy image to the clean image density and the noise that was added, which was Gaussian distributed. And we talked about that in terms of scale space, right? Like ink in water, you diffuse out. Imagine reversing the diffusion process. If you can get after these densities, if you can learn that score function, then you can reverse the process. Okay, and so there's the score function that you're learning, and that's essentially that upper bound on the KL divergence between the model you're learning and the actual density of a clean image. And then we said right here that you get into the definitions of the score function, right, which is based on the conditional mean. What is the probability of the clean image given the noisy data? Now that's where the diffusion comes in, because that's literally what you're after, trying to basically recreate a clean image from noisy data. That relates to these expectations. based on the denoiser that you're learning, and you can take the difference of the mean squared error of a perfect denoiser and the denoiser that you're learning. You want to minimize that. You can imagine setting that up as essentially a cost function. Again, that's that upper bound on that same KL divergence. Okay, so it's just the theoretical justification. I think the most interesting, personally, part is when they do the Jacobian decomposition, because now they're saying, look, how do we justify what this thing is actually doing, and how do we know it's really learning? You think about it in terms of eigenvalues and eigenvectors. Now you know the directions and the scaling that the function is actually doing with respect to the input data. You can analyze the oscillations in there, which is just a fancy way of saying, basically, let's take a look at how the input data are being treated. And if you look at how they're being treated, like those figures showed, you can see which part of the images are being picked up on by the denoiser. And lo and behold, it's not just random things, and it's not just memorization. It's actually picking up on specific geometric patterns in the images, okay? And again, there's a little bit more mathematical justification to stuff, but that is essentially the take-home message there. Okay, so I hope all that made sense. If you have questions, go on the app and please ask away. We can dig into some of the mathematics a little bit deeper. If you felt figure 4 and 5 was a little bit too high level, or that I went over that a little bit quickly, let's talk about it, okay? But by all means, read the paper yourself. Again, this is Generalization and Diffusion Models Arises from Geometry, Adaptive, Harmonic Representations. That's what those things are. The geometry, adaptive, harmonic representations are the things that are actually being learned, which was shown from that eigen decomposition quite beautifully. Okay, that's it for episode 3. Until the next one, take care.